Welcome to Prof E Plays. In this video, I'm going to give my review of Modiphius's Star Trek Adventures, Captain's Log solo role-playing game. First, a quick overview. Captain's Log offers a streamlined task resolution system, which makes the resolution of tasks easy so that figuring out the rules doesn't break the flow of play. Captain's Log also offers a number of useful Star Trek-themed tables for the soloist. The book also includes some good advice for narrative structure that will keep the pacing around what one would expect from an episode of Star Trek. On the other hand, the book is a bit light on canon and has a dodgy organization where many pieces of information feel a bit out of place. So let's get to it. The system in Captain's Log is based on the 2d20 system that is featured in many Modiphius games, including the original Star Trek Adventures. I tried soloing the old Star Trek Adventures and found it quite difficult, since that game is clearly designed with the group in mind, with the result that there's a significant amount of bookkeeping, which was really clumsy for me to keep track of by myself. Captain's Log streamlines the system significantly, though it's certainly recognizable for anyone who's familiar with the 2d20 system. Now, first, you only have to track two sets of stats, right? One for your main character and one for the ship, which would capture the abilities of your crew. So for any task, what you do, you decide what attribute and discipline are most appropriate, add those two scores together to create a target number, usually somewhere between, say, 9 and 16. And then you roll 2d20. If both d20 come up equal or less than your target number, you succeed and you also gain a point of momentum. Momentum can be spent for rerolls, for creating advantages, or for countering threat. Now, unlike in the original Star Trek Adventures, in Captain's Log you can only have 1 point of momentum at a time, so there's no reason to hoard it. In addition, if you have a relevant focus and score under the discipline score, you also get to add an immediate advantage, either something you choose or something you roll on a random table. A second possibility is that you just roll one of the d20 under the target number. This would be a success and also can still generate an advantage, potentially. Now, here there's also the possibility, though, of generating a threat, which usually means that you're going to have future rolls that are going to be more difficult, or you introduce an immediate complication. Now, finally, if neither of your d20 falls at or under the target, then you fail, and still might possibly generate threat from that as well. Now, like with Captain's Log's version of momentum, you only ever accumulate 1 point of threat, so this makes the bookkeeping very simple. One of my favorite things about this book is the random tables. The appendices for this book are about 60 pages, and most of those appendices are random tables. These include some random tables you'll only use once per mission, like laying out what the basic mission is, and others that you'll use much more frequently, like for NPCs in particular. I really like the syllable-based random name generator. In addition to the back of the book random tables, there are also random tables for character and ship generation in the early part of the book. Now, I will say, though, that you do need to exercise some care in how you use the random tables, or things can end up, well, too random to really be a sensible Star Trek narrative. And more on that in a little bit. Now, one thing I liked about this book was how it laid out the three-act structure, in which each act will be composed of 5 scenes, according to the advice given in this book. Of course, there's nothing particularly new about the three-act structure, but I suspect that many people who buy this book, like me, want to create stories that feel like a TV show. The three-act structure is key here, and I found the advice somewhat useful. However, there is one piece of advice I wish they had included. It's probably best to focus random rolls more in Act 1 when the stage is just being set. Then start decreasing the number of random rolls until, when you get to Act 3, you do very few random rolls at all, so you can focus on ending the story threads rather than stumbling into new ones. Now, when I played this, I wrote out all the main story threads when I got to Act 3 so that each scene could focus on bringing one of those to an end in a narratively satisfying way. Now, if I had kept using random tables, I feel like I could have ended up with far too many loose ends at the end of the story. So this book includes about 64 pages of setting information. That's about 20% of the book. Now, Naturally, the authors were having to walk a very fine line between too little and too much, since the Star Trek universe has hundreds of hours of canon from TV and movies alone. However, the particular choices that were made strike me as a bit odd. Like they spent half of a page talking about food replicators versus protein synthesizers in different eras, and a full page about the various ways that star dates are determined. Of the 60 pages of setting information, only about 8 are dedicated to the Star Trek timeline, which of course forces it to be treated in extremely broad strokes. This limits its usefulness as an inspiration of stories or as a way to integrate your story into the broader Star Trek universe. Another complaint is that the book organization is a bit dodgy. Now, in broad strokes, things look fine. First, setting information, then character and ship generation rules, then how you play and advice for playing the game. Finally, the random tables and appendices. This overall structure looks right, but the details are often strange. Parts of the setting information is really just giving advice about the different types of missions or games you could run. Rules about a particular topic are often found in more than one place, perhaps under both character generation and also the rules to play, and that can make it hard to look them up quickly if you want to. And probably the weirdest page for me was the last page before the appendices in the section titled Closing Advice. Now remember, this is Captain's Log, a solo role playing game, according to the cover. Well, the last page before the appendices is entirely devoted to how to play cooperatively and what to do when there are problems or conflict between players. Now, this felt particularly out of place since there actually was a section about cooperative play about 30 pages prior, including advice for dealing with similar issues. Now, making it even worse, the previous page had a great ending. Hey, let me read it to you. This is your captain's turn at the helm, and as one legendary captain once said, risk is our business. That's a great end for this book. Except that instead of being done, the book continues for another page. The end we actually get depends on whether we focus on the main text or on the boxes. If we focus on the main text, the ending is now, here, and I quote, the player may express that the game isn't something they're enjoying and desire to bow out of their own accord, a decision you should feel free to consider if no acceptable accommodation can be reached. What a bummer! Now, if you decide to include the box at the bottom of the page, then you'll end with an example about how two players are rolling against each other as they're trying to control the same captain cooperatively. The last couple sentences here are, since Heather's approach calls on Takeda's skill as a tactician, she'll roll Takeda's reason plus security. Mike will roll Takeda's insight plus command. What a dull way to end the book. I dare say the book would have been better off without that page, or if it had been moved about 30 pages forward. Now, a bit about my experience playing. I got this book a few months ago. I pre ordered it not long after I learned about it, but it took me a while to get around to actually playing it. Anyway, I decided to mostly use randomization to make my character. I ended up with a Gorn freighter captain. Since he was Gorn, I figured being in Starfleet was pretty unlikely, but his personal history made it also unlikely that he was in the Gorn military. His parents were apparently involved with diplomacy. So an independent freighter, that seemed reasonable. The random tables I rolled on for mission indicated that he was dealing with a malfunctioning weather control system on a terraformed colony. That makes sense. He's probably just delivering parts for it. Well, in the first scene, he came across a city ship heading toward that same planet, and he and the captain of that ship, who were apparently hostile in some way, they got caught in a temporal anomaly and thrown back in time. It really did feel very Star Trek. I followed the advice that I gave earlier, and I used lots of randomization in that first act, and then scaled it back so that the third act involved basically no randomization at all. This worked really well for bringing things to a satisfying conclusion, and that's something I personally have often found is difficult for me in a solo game. So this idea of 3 acts, 5 scenes each, that felt like about the right pace for this game. So it was good advice. So overall, I enjoyed playing this game. As someone who has been solo role-playing for a couple of years now, who enjoys Star Trek, and who found soloing the original Star Trek adventures too clumsy, I'm really glad this option is out there. This version of the 2d20 system solos very well, and I suspect it could be adapted without too much work to other settings. I also suspect that someone who likes sci-fi in general would find the random tables here useful with only a slight modification, like changing the term Federation to something else. Now, one thing I can't settle on is whether this would be a good book for somebody who's making their first attempt at solo role playing. So yeah, on this I'm torn. Now, if you're already familiar with how role-playing games work, then you'd probably be fine. However, I'm not convinced that the guidance in this book gives enough solo role-playing philosophy to really allow a true beginner to feel like they know what they're doing. That said, solo role-playing is, like many pastimes, a skill that improves with practice. So if you love Star Trek and are interested in solo role-playing, well, why not boldly go where you've never gone before? This is Profi Plays, signing off.